Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Marcus Eeman. I am a senior customs manager here at Flexport. Talking about the end of de minimis coming to in 2 days' time, tomorrow, last day for de minimis clearances for the rest of the world. But what kind of happens next, and what are some of the steps you can take? So we have a lot of stuff to go over, but before we begin, just a few housekeeping items. First is that on your screen, you'll see a sidebar on the right of the main stage where you can submit questions. At the end of the presentation, we'll have a Q&A, always very popular, and we try to answer audience questions that come in. So please get your questions in early as we prioritize by time. In that same sidebar, you see a tab labeled Documents. This is where you can download a copy of today's slides and find other helpful resources. Before we begin, just a quick legal note here. Please keep in mind that all of our information providing the session is based on the situation at this current time and may not be customized to your specific business requirements. We always recommend reaching out to a Flexport expert to discuss your particular situation. Joining me today is my colleague, Darby Meegan. He's our Senior Director of Omnichannel, our kind of e-commerce solution here at Flexport. And he is going to talk in the second half of the slides about some operational aspects. To kick off the agenda here, we're going to just go over, okay, what kind of universe are we operating in here? What are some of the changes, especially as it pertains to postal clearances and the end of de minimis? What does a postal world maybe look like here? And what are the operational readiness things that maybe you can do today to prepare yourself for some of these changes? Okay, so we're going to start with just a kind of a quick timeline of the year. I feel like, kind of knowing sort of how we got here, I think helps a little bit. And quite a lot's happened since February 1st. On February 1st, Trump declared a national emergency to Canada, Mexico, China over fentanyl smuggling. They're saying there's too much fentanyl coming in over the border, so we're going to raise particular tariff rates on each of these countries. And we're also going to ban de minimis 3 days from now for all of these countries. And so that was issued on a Saturday. The last day for de minimis was Tuesday. So de minimis ended on the Tuesday, and it was nothing short of chaotic. We had quite a lot of packages that were uncleared. Shippers didn't have time to prepare. A lot of flights were booked. A lot of planes were loaded, and they flew anyway. Something that we'd find out later is that when this de minimis was banned, just JFK Airport alone had over 1 million parcels stuck, 1 million de minimis parcels that were uncleared a month later because they were waiting for all this information that they didn't really have in a de minimis environment. Consignees weren't ready. They weren't going to pay for it. Are these going to be abandoned? Do they go to general order? There were so many questions that it led to 1 million parcels being stuck at JFK Airport. 3 days later, Trump reversed course, saying, okay, we're going to allow de minimis until, quote, adequate systems are in place to fully and expeditionally process and collect these duties. So ended de minimis for 3 days, quite a bit of grief. Trump reversed course, said, okay, I'll wait for the secretary to let me know that customs is ready to handle this kind of volume and able to shut down de minimis. So a few months go by, we get to April 2nd, where Liberation Day had all those reciprocal tariff rates on all these other countries, all these different tariff rates going up. And it also announced the end of de minimis for China specifically, starting on May 2nd, 30 days later. It also included a clause in there that said de minimis was going to end for the rest of the world, also when, quote, adequate systems are in place. Now, if you've been coming to these webinars before, you may remember from that one, we said how, China is about 70% of all the parcel volume. So if they're able to solve, for the biggest case, if they're able to solve de minimis for China, solve ending de minimis for China, it's probably going to be pretty easy for them to solve de minimis for the rest of the world. So on May 2nd, de minimis did end for China. It also created this idea of allowing for postal entries as kind of the only way to send small parcels from abroad into the United States, but with duties collected on those parcels. So that happened on May 2nd. July 4th, we see something on the legislative side where the one big beautiful bill signed into a law. It did many things. One of the things it did for de minimis, though, is that it created new penalties. It created a $5,000 penalty for a first-time violation of de minimis shipping rules, and also and $10,000 for every penalty thereafter. And then ends de minimis in law by July 1st, 2027. Remember, the president's actions are executive orders, and so in theory, a new president could undo that very quickly with no notice. But this actually ends de minimis in law altogether July 1st, 2027, 2 years. So with those new penalties, now there's actually some new teeth. Remember, Congress has to be the one to be able to pass new taxes, new penalties. So in order for doing this, the president, was now able to tell U.S. Customs, okay, go out and enforce this rule. You now have this penalty clause backing you up. At the end of July, we had a new executive order that ended de minimis for all countries, saying it's going to happen on August 28th, tomorrow, or the 29th. I'm sorry, the 28th is the last day. 29th is when it ends. And it's based on, and this executive order is based on the IEEPA National Emergency of Unbalanced Trade. So that national emergency that was declared on April 2nd, that the president used to put into place all these reciprocal tariffs, he's using that same justification for unbalanced trade to ban de minimis from all other countries in the world. So then starting on the 29th, no de minimis clearances are allowed into the United States. Notable exceptions still being personal luggage, so people coming through the United States still get some allowance coming through. There's also bona fide gifts being sent through the mail up to $100. Those are also still allowed. And then postal clearances are also still available for the time being as well. So that is kind of where we've sort of been moving through in our recent history this year. But let's talk a little bit more about postal entries. Right now, we sort of have this state where de minimis, whether it was a manifest clearance that we talked about, or a Type 86 we talked about, or an ECCF type setup, those are going to be ending. And so what we're seeing instead now is postal is potentially the only way you really get small parcels back into the United States in any kind of similar operational setup to how you've been going before. And so if you're not familiar, I was going to dive into how these postal entries work a little bit, how it is going to cost, how these things function. There's still an $800 limit because the provision for postal entries still uses that 1321 language about $800. And so it's still $800 per parcel. It could be multiple items in the parcel, same as before. And of course, CBP can still require a standard entry at any time. Obviously, though, this is not duty-free like so many of those like the de minimis parcels from before, but we just are still seeing some of those existing pieces of structure. One thing that is slightly different from what we saw with de minimis is that de minimis had that $800 limit, and it was per person per day, right? That was kind of the rule, $800 per consignee per day, per person per day. The postal entries don't have that same explicit limit, however, but we saw quite a lot of enforcement from CBP before where they said, okay, if you're using de minimis and you're cutting up a $4,000 shipment into 5 de minimis shipments, well, now you're trying to skirt customs rules. We're going to force you to file a traditional entry, or we're going to penalize you, or both. And so while that still doesn't really happen here, and some of the tools that they built out, as far as I know, I don't think CBP, like the Type 86 flow, they built a lot of tools this year to try to help them track and target and know, like, okay, is a consignee going over the $800 limit? I don't know if any of those tools are being used in the postal environment. So I don't know if that was all throwaway work. Maybe they can repurpose some of it here. But that same kind of rule doesn't still apply. And now it's backed up with these pretty strong penalties. And that $5,000 to $10,000, that's not per shipment. That is per parcel. So a $50, $60 parcel, a pair of shoes that is violative for some reason can get a massive penalty as a result for skirting those rules. So the language that was used in the One Big Beautiful Bill said, if it violates any other provision of U.S. customs law. So the things that we been hearing from CBP that they're going to focus on, misstating origin. Why is that? Because I'll talk about it on the next slide. The country of origin will affect what maybe rate you have to pay. Misstating the contents, trying to say it's one thing when it's actually another, lying about what's in there, that's another reason. The parties involved, are you sending it to multiple suppliers? Is this also you just using shell companies? Those also might be something that they're targeting. The fourth one is also the value itself. Did you misstate the value to try to stay under that $800 limit? Those are probably the places where customs are going to use these new $5,000, $10,000 penalties that they have at their disposal. Another thing to kind of think about for postal that's a little bit different than de minimis is that there's going to be a weight limit involved. The Universal Postal Union, the UPU, has agreed on a rule of 20 kilos per parcel for international package shipping. The US obviously has like a 70 pound, which is like 31 kilo. They have a 31 kilo rule, but assume roughly 20 kilos of weight. So de minimis didn't have a weight limit at all. Obviously, shipping costs are maybe their own enforcing weight limit, but postal actually does. So this isn't probably a problem for apparel shippers, sheets, those kinds of things, textile goods, shoes. But housewares, stainless steel pots and pans, industrial uses, turbochargers for car parts, those aren't always lightweight. And so they may see a little bit more of an effect here, or postal just maybe isn't an option for no other reason than weight. And finally, there's also this new fee structure. I'm going to go to the next slide and talk about that new fee structure. So it kind of comes out in 2 flavors in what they said. And it comes down to either the IEEPA rate or the parcel flat fee. The IEEPA rate is what those Liberation Day tariffs were about. And so it's based on the country of origin, not the country of export. And so this is, I think, a common thing, especially if you've been kind of operating in an e-commerce de minimis world exclusively. You haven't really paid as much attention to kind of identify, okay, what is origin, what is export? Origin, in general, is the country in which a good last underwent a substantial transformation. And that's what customs cares about. When did something go through enough processing such that it lost its character or identity and got a new identity as a result of that processing or manufacturing? That is what makes something, what confers the origin to a product in general terms. Where it's coming from, the country of export, is largely irrelevant in this conversation and is irrelevant for finding out what is the IEEPA rate. And so these IEEPA rates were country specific. They range anywhere from 10 to 41%. UK being the low down there at 10%. I think it was Cambodia, I think at 41%. I think Switzerland was 39%. And so it's based on that origin of the product. So what's going to happen is the origin of the product will have to be declared so that that IEEPA rate could then be calculated as well as the value. So like, okay, 10% of a $50 parcel would be $5 owed, right? The other option that they say carriers can use is a flat fee. And for this one, you don't have to necessarily, you don't necessarily have to have the same level of detail. Maybe you don't have to necessarily have the same amount of value as you had in the parcel, although many postal carriers will require that declaration. It will also depend on that IEEPA rate for that country. So again, country of origin is really going to matter here. So if that IEEPA rate was less than 16%, the flat fee equivalent is $80. If it's between 16 and 25, 160. If it's over 25, it's $200 per parcel. And the way this is actually chosen by the postal carriers. So the postal carriers are the ones who are going to be, or the qualified paying parties, are the ones who are going to be making this determination and saying, okay, Customs, I'm going to be collecting all parcels for the next month, and I'm going to be assessing a flat fee rate for all these parcels, or I'm going to be assessing the IEEPA rate for all these parcels, but they can only choose one. And they have to choose one for their entire business for the entire month going forward. And then Customs will then use that to try to calculate, okay, how much duty is owed based on all those postal shipments that came in. How much is actually owed from this? So this is the choice of the carrier, not a choice of a broker, not a choice of necessarily, the shipper or you as like an importer, the e-commerce buyer. And that isn't necessarily something you get to choose. I do want to put a note here about China that is a little bit of a source of confusion. China, remember, as you saw in the previous slide, they had their de minimis end on May 2nd, and they had a little bit of a change of rates. But then, currently today or before today, China postal rates are either $100 flat fee or 54% based on whichever is greater. Now, this is where we get into a little interesting spot. The executive order that ended postal shipping. That executive order that ended postal shipping said, I'm still going to preserve this executive order that I put on China, limiting de minimis, and any subsequent revisions there to that executive order, which would include this $100 or 54%, whichever is greater, fee for China. But then in that same executive order, it says, for all countries, this is the logic, the IEEPA rate or the parcel flat fee for all countries. And so the question that is a little bit undetermined right now that I'd like to see some sort of guidance on here is China going to be subject to the IEEPA rate rule as part of like the second half of the executive order, or do they preserve this higher rate? Now, my guess is this is a bit of an assumption here. I'm going to guess that they want to try to have the higher rate for China. Now, I'm not certain if that's actually the case or not. We'll maybe have to kind of see what happens starting tomorrow of what CBP is going to expect. But I think we're probably going to see that they want to have that higher rate on China rather than potentially the lower rate. Because remember, China currently right now is on a pause, right? Their current pause rate is like a 10%. They have the all country rate for IEEPA reciprocal. So do they want to go back to the 10% for Chinese origin postal? I'm not sure. I don't think so. I think they're going to want to stick to the 54% or $100 flat fee. So that is kind of how the fee structure works as well here. But with all this, okay, de minimis is going away. I'm losing a lot. I now have these really big fees. What if I have to pay $160 because my carrier chose to use the flat fee model on my shipment that's worth $100? How can I make this work? The silver lining is that I think valuation now gets to open up just a little bit more. In valuation, before this may have actually been something that was a problem, right? Because for valuation, there's been 3 rulings kind of on this. I cited one here from Storecraft and Jammers on Aritzia. These are CBP customs rulings determining the value. And in each of these cases, they look for the bona fide sale. Where is it? What's actually causing the sale for import? How is it actually getting from overseas to the U.S.? So this wasn't their buy rates. This was the sell rates. Like, what is this actually being retailed for? And that was a problem in a de minimis environment, right? When you only had $800 per person per day. So if they bought something for $800, you had to declare that retail price, even though your own purchase price from the manufacturer is lower than 800. If they had that $800 purchase cost, the retail cost, that was worse. So now, if you have an possible option here, is that if you are able to move to conventional entries, I should clarify that. If you're only able to move to the conventional entries setting up here, you may be able to use a lower value. You may be able to use the buy value, the buy price, not your retail price. But I do want to use a bit of a caution here. Customs valuation rules are very situational. Contracts, parties involved, documentation, all of these things could maybe affect the valuation calculation of the outcomes here. So these are 3 examples that I thought were good examples for kind of an e-commerce setup where you might see them saying, okay, no, it has to be the retail price. But if you're a brand who's able to move your product into the United States in bulk, your bona fide sale for export might be that price that you paid to your supplier, not the price that your customer is going to buy from you from, not the retail price. So this maybe does allow for a little bit of a possibility if you want to move forward into a conventional entry environment. And so I found an illustration here of how to create this. I saw there's an e-commerce website that sells cashmere sweaters, and we'll say it's Bangladeshi origin. It retails for 50. Your buy price is maybe around 13, give or take 15 or so. You have your HTS classification as a standard rate of 4%. The IEEPA reciprocal rate on Bangladesh is 20%. And if you see on the right, I kind of ran the calculation here. So if you use a postal entry, the IEEPA rate is 20% on a $50 retail cost that you have to declare. So you're spending a 20%, that IEEPA postal rate is 20% based on the retail cost, the retail value. So 20% of 50 is $10. But if you bring it in consumption and then you fulfill out of the United States, you may actually be paying less in tariffs. Now, this isn't always this may not hold in every case, but in many cases, you may see this option happening here, where it's actually quite a bit less expensive by $1.70. This is just for a single sweater. You still have a higher rate. You still have to pay the 4% standard tariff. You still have to pay the 20% IEEPA rate, and you may have some other fees like MPF or something else, HMF. But you're paying a combined 24% on 13 rather than 20% on 50, which overall lowers your duty exposure. This is maybe just one kind of area for savings if you want to move to a conventional entry filing environment. Other places you might save is just on freight, right? It's cheaper to ship in bulk if they don't always have to be individual parcels to an individual consumer going overseas. That's one. Second one is maybe you have cheaper delivery costs. Maybe you can use better networks within the United States, more versatility and better transit times. The third one is that you also might get better terms from your supplier of these cashmere sweaters. Maybe you can say, well, I'm gonna I don't need to just fulfill 500 at a time. I'm going to place a bulk order for 5,000, and maybe your buy cost isn't 13, maybe it lowers down to $10, right? And then all of a sudden you see even more savings from a duty perspective. I didn't even put on here what the flat rate postal fee would be on this chart, because it would just be a bar that just goes straight up and off the slide, maybe about $160 tariff cost. So obviously that flat fee postal rate is maybe easier for some of these postal carriers to enforce and to collect on, but it would be far worse probably for most brands to switch to this. Okay. I also hear about this one. This has come up before, and I just copied this slide from what happened back in April, talking about China as well, where we say like, oh, is Type 11 a good alternative for de minimis? Is an informal entry the solution to save you from the end of de minimis? And the answer is probably not. And the reason why is because there's a $250 maximum value on Type 11 entries when those products are subject to Chapter 99. Or subchapter 3, which is IEEPA tariffs, Section 301 tariffs, which is basically everything nowadays. So with that, the Type 11 entry has just lost its value. Like on paper, it's up to $2,500, but with these subchapter, the subchapter limit of 250, it gets a lot harder. So the problem you run into is if you do Type 11, you end up having to file a lot more of these entries. And for a customs broker, there's not that much savings in terms of work. there's very minimal savings in terms of like the difference between how much does it, how much time does it take to file a type 1 versus how much time does it take to file a type 11. For a broker, there's not a lot of difference. For a broker, most of the data elements are still the same. All the PGA reporting requirements largely the same. All the documentation requirements largely the same. There's a slight difference. You don't have to have a bond, for instance, unless CBP requires it. You save a little bit on merchandise processing fee versus informal fee. But just because you need so many entries, even at a very aggressive $25 entry fee, you're still probably paying more using more type 11 entries, because if you notice that third bullet from the bottom on each side, you only need one entry for a type 1 for this entire shipment. For a type 11, you need 40 entries. And those 40 entries, there's a certain amount of like sunk costs every time a broker wants to open up an entry for a type 11. They still have to fill out header information, manifest information. They have to key a CI. They have to have a CI. They have to add the details here. So there's a certain amount of like sunk costs that a broker just can't make up. So there's just not like kind of enough savings for a broker here. So even if they're doing 40 of them and they're giving you a very aggressive rate, in general, they're probably better off using a type 1. I don't think type 11 is really a solution or a savings. Even despite the name being called an informal entry, this isn't actually a solution to replace a de minimis filing. So what does it mean to kind of be in a post-postal world? What happens from here? Well, I'm going to look a little bit into the future here. And I think one thing we're going to see for sure is that we're going to see a little bit of craziness, as maybe Newman can tell you about what it's like to be part of postal service, is that there are these new penalties that are pretty high. We're talking $5,000 to $10,000 per parcel. It's not going to take many violations to really rattle the cage of some of these new carriers that are coming online to try to pay for it, these qualified paying parties for postal rates. Carriers are probably going to tighten some of their contract language, right? They don't want to be left in the lurch if they have all of a sudden a pretty expensive, violation that maybe now they are responsible for paying. How are they going to get it back from an overseas seller? They're probably nervous about this. Maybe they're going to ask for prepayments or letters of credit or something like that. Or they may just say, this is just too difficult. We got our hands slapped with some penalties. We're just going to drop out of the market altogether. The other major thing that we're seeing right now, and I saw this morning, we're seeing up to 25 countries that their mail services have said, we're not going to send parcels to the United States until we know how these tariff rates are going to work, about who pays them, who collects them, how we have to remit these payments. There's just too many unknowns. And so like my question about China, like, is it the existing one, the 54% $100, or is it the new, current existing 10%, suspended rate on China? I don't know. And I don't think some of these other postal unions know either. And so they are saying, we're okay, until we have more clarity from the government, we're just not going to ship parcels to the United States at all through the Postal Service. We saw DHL announce a couple of days ago, they're saying, okay, we're also not going to process any postal entries going to the United States, again, for not knowing enough about what is or isn't happening here. I think another one we're also going to see is how postal is also maybe going to play with some of the other duties that were levied, right? We talked about IEEPA reciprocal tariffs, but there are some other tariffs that have been placed out there that we're not totally sure how these are going to play with. So the 232 duties. So these are the national security tariffs on steel, aluminum, copper. There's a big thing for steel and aluminum about 2 weeks ago, an additional list. Brazilian special rates, right? So Brazil has an extra 10% or 40% being assessed. The Indian oil tariffs are going into effect today. So if India's bought Russian oil, Trump doesn't like that. He put an extra 25% on India. That's not an IEEPA reciprocal tariff, though. That's a different tariff. So are that going to be assessed? Is that part of the India calculation? I don't think so. On the way that it's written, it doesn't read like it is. The EU and Japan have these IEEPA rates that are the product's base HTS rate, up to a max of 15%. I think it's just the 15%, but that's not necessarily a given. So there could be a pricing game where somebody says, well, I'm going to send a lot of postal entries because a 15% IEEPA rate is a lot lower than a 50% Section 232 rate. I think this kind of pricing game is going to happen. I think the government's going to see it pretty quickly, and I think the White House is probably going to change it pretty fast. And how exactly it changes or what it changes to, that I don't think we know yet, and so that's a little bit of a mystery, but I would expect more clarification about how all some of these other tariffs also would apply in a postal or would apply or not apply in a postal environment. And so you're saying that there's a chance of court case relief. And similarly, I'd also say it's probably about a 1 in a million chance. There is a case currently going before the courts, you may have heard, that are challenging the legality of the IEEPA tariffs Does the president even have the authority at all to levy tariffs under IEEPA? That's kind of one main question here. And that's really what the case is about, is can they levy these reciprocal tariffs? But remember, these executive orders that also levy these tariffs also ban de minimis. So pursuant to this national emergency. So if the national emergency is ruled to not be able to be justification, does this also potentially challenge the legality of de minimis bans? I don't think so, but maybe. If the ruling is sufficiently broad and they say these executive orders and these emergencies are completely bogus, it could be that by court order, de minimis does come back because the underlying executive order that banned de minimis is ruled to be illegal. So if that were to happen, that could bring it back. I don't want anybody thinking that's going to happen. I think it's pretty unlikely, but depending on how broadly written some of these subsequent court rulings are, it's possible this could maybe come back in some format. But I would not recommend putting a lot of weight on that. And so okay, so if you haven't really done consumption entries before, what is kind of the first few things you need to do to kind of start your consumption entries? Get a customs bond in place. A customs bond is like a small insurance policy that protects the revenue of U.S. Customs, and every importer needs one. Register your EIN with CBP. It's called a Form 5106, and those are usually done by your customs broker. So if you don't have any of this stuff, find yourself a customs broker. They can help you get set up. They can help you adapt and move into this environment where you do have to file consumption entries. They can dive into some of your valuation questions about, okay, wait a minute, can I mark a sell in this webinar? I can maybe save money by declaring my buy price, not my sell price. I want to make sure I'm square with that. We can help you out. The second thing is to make sure your HTS codes are correct. In a de minimis environment, frankly, CBP wasn't looking as closely, and it mattered less because there was no duty being collected. That is not the case in consumption entries, and certainly not the case in this trade environment. So make sure you know your own classifications. If you're not sure, classification at flexport.com. That email that they handle our classification services here. We can do price and quote on like what our services are, and we store all of these in Flexport's product library for you to review anytime. In addition, HTS is just the start. But there are other things called partnering government agencies, PGAs, like TSCA, the EPA, or the FDA. They also have regulatory oversight, and maybe you've never had to provide information because before, maybe there were allowances for de minimis that you no longer get to enjoy. Making sure you know all the documentation you need as well. That's another one that really matters. So if you've been shipping footwear via de minimis, you may have never had to provide a footwear form. You may not know what IFI or FIDRA is, but these forms are technically required for every shipment that you bring in a footwear. Mill certificates for steel products. Textiles have fiber, construction, gender requirements, especially for apparel. Licenses, IP. You should have always had your IP licenses for bringing in any sort of trademark product, and I'm sure you already have it. But now is maybe a good time to make sure you have it in order, ready to go to be able to provide to a broker on a 7-day timeline for any kind of IP related holds from customs. And finally, you should look at your landed costs. Like, okay, knowing all this information, knowing my new HTS, what should I expect? What should that rough landed cost be? Flexport has some great tools to kind of be able to model that and show that and talk it through with what you can kind of expect to pay per unit and how this may change in this post-de minimis environment. And with that, I'm going to bring my partner here on stage, Darby, and talk a little bit more about the operational side. I just did a lot on the regulatory side, but Darby, how does this actually work in practice now if I actually wanted to switch to consumption entries in the U.S.?
Great question. We'll let you go off stage, take a drink of water, a deep breath. That was quite extensive, the coverage. So we appreciate the diligence that you've done to present it. And
I will go in Q&A. Yeah.
Save it for the Q&A. A friendly plug, there is a Q&A. Many of you have already begun using that Q&A. If you have questions, please ask those questions to us as well. Later on, there are going to be some resources available where you can reach out to a Flexport professional to be able to answer some of the more specific questions. So with 15 minutes left and certainly some extra time on Q&A at the end, we would encourage you, if you have a very specific scenario, to reach out to one of those resources. Operational readiness of the United States domestic supply chain. I will go to the next slide. The end of de minimis poses a lot of impacts, not only to the postal network, not only to brands that are disrupted as they're trying to clear those borders, but for the American consumer, the American brand, the brands all over the world that sell into America. There are some pretty clear impacts to peak season. One could be higher cost of shipping. As Marcus talked, the tariff avoidance that was previously available during de minimis is going away, and there are other options. Two, potential delays. Certainly, as 25 different international postal carriers have declared pausing packages while they wait for clarification, those packages are not going to reach consumers. So messaging on websites, we expect brands to begin putting that on their website that the packages are delayed or expect delays upcoming. Three, one of the perks, I think, to the American consumer is as inventory moves into the United States, into domestic warehouses, faster delivery is possible to end consumers. There is no customs clearance process if the goods have already cleared customs when shipping to an end consumer. That means there are no potential delays at airports, through customs, at border crossings. There is a big shift in strategy happening and already happening this year. As Marcus mentioned, de minimis was pretty radically changed earlier for China-based origins. That is, more inventory is already in U.S. warehouses, which means brands looking to get into U.S. warehouses ahead of peak, as they've ramped inventory into those other warehouses across the world, are going to be trying to move inventory into the United States. That means unforeseen congestion. Certainly earlier this year, we saw trucking, we saw drayage, we saw containers being rerouted, and that caused delays, congestion, and etc. So be prepared for that as you shift your strategy or potentially shift your strategy. And there you see a rise in bulk and shipping ocean freight. I think that means just a rerouting there. Actions to take. First and foremost, I will let Marcus's clear guidance on your low value shipments, how you will be able to clear those. The big thing there that he mentioned is the postal carriers get to determine which fees are assessed on a monthly cadence. Audit those, get clarity from your carriers and parcel providers as to what that will be and how you can see around that corner a bit. Explore fulfilling from the United States. I will be going into these in a bit more depth in a second. Consolidate orders to reduce entry frequency. As he mentioned, some of them have requirements on the number of parcels that enter. Some of them have requirements on the dollar value that enter. Make sure you have accurate HTS codes. As he mentioned, footwear. There is additional paperwork that's required. Today, reach out to your customs broker, reach out to Flexport. We're happy to discuss with you what those requirements will look like in the new world for you. And then the last one, always a plug. We recommend partnering with somebody who is a logistics provider that understands customs. It's a really fast changing environment. On the right, you're seeing that there is a live blog for updates as well as a tariff simulator. We have folks working around the clock monitoring these. What a lot of people don't know is the executive order comes out or a statement from the administration that is followed by an entry into the Federal Registry. Those have been lagged at some points as they've finished those documents. Our data updates based on the laws and the regulations that are being input and not only on announcements. So take a deep breath, look at those links later, bookmark them. I think it's tariffs.flexport.com if you'd like to get a hub for where you can learn more. Next slide. If you are running out the clock and are currently experiencing these delays, two things to consider. One, your customers may be increasing your customer support load. 82% of online shoppers prefer to buy from a brand that shows an expected delivery date, with 38% abandoning orders if they don't know when they will arrive. How I read that from these two studies that have come out in the last 3 years. One is customers who have a tracking number and that tracking number stops moving. If there's a delay of about 3 days, our internal estimate is about 30% of customers will write in whenever a 3-day delay happens. If these packages are paused, as reported by NBC on the right side, DHL is pausing them, customers may begin writing in as they see this news, as they see their packages not moving. That may happen for domestic shippers as well, as this congestion is in the network or standard delays occur. So be braced for parcel delays and for customers to write into you. The volume also, as people were racing to get to this timeline of the 29th and actually a little bit earlier due to these carriers, They may have ran sales. The Labor Day sales that are in effect today have been seeing parcel volumes increase across the United States. So be prepared for that. The second one is the clarification that Marcus mentioned. We are waiting for the clarification, just the same as some of these carriers, on what will be happening. And we've seen that freeze. So be aware, ask questions, reach out to your representatives at your carriers or your logistics companies to see how they will be handling these and if they have any guidance they can provide you. Again, this reporting is relatively recent, in the last 2 days or so. So be aware that they are still trying to get clarification themselves. If you are looking at what do I do, because this seems like an insurmountable mountain to climb in the next 3 months ahead of peak, 3 considerations to make. 1, warehousing availability in the United States in key areas may be strained. Our recommendation is get a quote early and soon. 1, brands may have rushed inventory into these warehouses earlier this year in the uncertain tariff environment during a pause or a different tariff environment altogether. So 1, some brands may be overstocked and already present in these warehouses. That means you may be working with logistics providers who want to lag inventory in. They want you to have tighter inventory controls. Reach out to them, clarify that. 2, your warehousing providers that you're reaching out to now may be trying to look for a longer contract so that they can recover their costs in favorable terms as they offset the need for overtime, as they offset the need for inoptimal storage means in that warehouse. If the warehouse was ready for peak and now needs more space, they may be rushing to get shelving. They may be rushing to get other things like that. So 1, warehousing availability. Check with any provider. Give them clear forecasts. 2, carrier considerations. This is probably my least favorite bullet point, but one that is of the utmost importance in an increased cost environment. Many carriers set their peak season surcharges for in parcels based on volume targets that have already begun being quantified. So that means if you're using a 3PL that has carrier contracts that you will be shipping on, you need to get them your forecasts. You need to understand how they've set those volumes. It's possible that they've negotiated better volumes. It's possible that you're covered by your current relationship. It is worth having the conversation with any provider to understand the peak season surcharges that you may find applicable to your business. You also may need to change your carrier contracts. Some carrier methods require an account number per location. Changing that location may result in different sortation. It may mean different service levels are available. It may mean a more optimal cost structure to your in parcel. The biggest thing there is ask clear questions around the carrier contracts that any warehousing partner you are working with has. There are some carriers available, hyper-regional, regional, and even national carriers that you are able to avoid peak season surcharges as a perk of using their business or as a pro for them. Ask those questions directly to your provider or into potential providers. 3, operations performance, one of my favorite things. Try to give them as many forecasts as possible on when containers will arrive, when transitions will occur, because the best plan is the plan that exists. The worst plan is one that is just arriving as containers are made available. The biggest thing is check with your provider or potential provider to say, if I can get you these inventory, how quickly can you receive it? Note, they will probably try to stagger inventory if they are in a position where capacity is limited. Scheduling, compliance, anything like that that's required to inbound to a warehouse, make sure you're clarifying that with them. If your inventory is headed to a marketplace, make sure they have pickups, make sure they can handle your specific goods. Giving a running start. I will not go through all these bullet points, but happy to screenshot it. That's Command-Shift-4 on your keyboard if you're on Mac. Otherwise, I don't know what it is, but grab that snipping tool on Windows. 1, give them as clear information about your catalog, your products, your inventory position, any specific requirements for your SKUs. Have that bundled, ready to go, and be able to provide it, ideally without too many back and forths on what your product is. 2, forecasts. I'll skip over the next 2. Outbound order forecasts, both in non-peak periods as well as through peak periods, are very important as they're planning labor, getting the right staff in the building. They are going to be potentially calling overtime over that weekend, ensuring that your packages can get to the consumer by the holiday season so that they have it relatively quickly and are available to get it under trees this holiday is a key thing. Again, 82% of shoppers want to know an expected delivery and 38% will abandon if they don't. So if you're seeing an extended handling time after the peak period. Note, get that forecast immediately. Inventory, special pack out, sales channels and marketplaces, B2B wholesale. The last two are relatively important because the data flow of your orders into the WMS that your provider is using is paramount. Making sure that they know which marketplace it's going to, which carriers to use, which drop shipping channels you use, pack out required, routing guides, etc. I will not belabor this point too much, but bundle that all up. Let them know as soon as possible what shipping methods you use. Consider a staged approach. If you are shipping from overseas into America and you have inventory in those locations that you've been shipping into de minimis or via de minimis, note that it may be best to hold that inventory overseas if you can have it transition into the United States market in relatively short order. That's because you can stage the tariffs and customs and duties that you will be paying as it comes into America. However, note during peak periods, those SLAs often stretch. So delineate inventory that's needed absolutely for this peak period and send that inventory to America, and then potentially stagger inventory for Q1 and Q2 to a later date. It will also mean that they are able to service your inventory sooner. Pay attention to inbound deadlines. A lot of 3PLs begin telegraphing what dates the inventory that is arriving at the warehouse will be made available. For instance, ours is early November to have it guaranteed deliverable for Black Friday, Cyber Monday. Please ask that question is, if I send you inventory on November 15th, what happens for Black Friday? Will you be in a back-ordered situation? Will that inventory be shippable to consumers? Please validate that. And then the last one is you can also stagger that inbound customs. I'm going through now to frequently asked questions. We have quite a few. If you have an email, you can see customsbd@flexport.com. My email is dmeegan@flexport.com. Happy to connect you as well with any warehousing experts on our side. I know that it is quite a mouthful as I rush through a lot of the operational preparedness, but the answer is reach out. We'd be happy to help you get that data pack ready. We'd be happy to help you navigate. I will say there are quite a few questions on how to persist using international shipping methods, as Marcus has covered. Those are being clarified. But Marcus, I think I'll welcome you back to the stage so we can answer some of these specific questions. I'm glad you got a breather, hopefully a drink of water, maybe ran to the bathroom, because as our customs expert, I think most of these questions are for you.
Yeah, I'm looking at it, and I think the one I want to start with here is I think I see like 8 questions, all kind of around the question of like samples and prototypes, or something like that. So I'm going to pick one that I think is like maybe the most comprehensive. I hope it'll square it away. I think it says, can you address the best way to ship samples and prototypes? We used to always just use de minimis. Now that's gone. We're using 98110060 for samples and 98178501 for prototypes. But will that eliminate all of the duties? Also, how do we value items that have no market value? So this has 2 really, really good questions in it here. So the first one is, yes, you can use those for samples. The 9811 code for samples, 98110060, that is allowed to be used for samples. However, the fine print of that provision does say they need to be bona fide samples that are either like less than $1 or those that are torn, perforated, marked, or otherwise treated such that their only use could only ever be a sample. This is not some neat trick to like get past this. This isn't like de minimis part 2, but also those 98 codes do eliminate the IEEPA tariffs as well. So you don't pay IEEPA tariffs on this. You don't pay 232 if it's subject to not all of the 98 codes, but many of the 98 codes exempt you from those other duties that got placed this year, in addition to the base duty as well. 981785 for prototypes as well. I believe it's note 7 in chapter 85 talks about all the details in order to be considered a prototype. It has to be a pre-production, in production thing, purely for use only, for quality assurance, testing, evaluation. This isn't, if you probably aren't going to have 10,000s of something coming in for quality assurance. You're probably going to have 1 or 2 or 3 things for quality assurance. So this, again, is not some sort of like secret loophole deep in the tariff for you to use. This is truly only meant for prototypes. And so how do you use that with de minimis? You can either use kind of like small parcel with traditional entries, so like going through a FedEx or a DHL for international shipping for this, that's probably one way to do it. If you wanted to bring in several different samples all at the same time, you can do that too, or you have a regular commercial import and you want to bring in samples with that, you can add that as like a line on the bottom of the invoice, clearly indicating it's a sample. And as long as the merchandise is truly in a condition to only be used as a sample. So a lot of questions there for samples. That was a good one.
That is a great one. I've got one for
Yeah.
you. Will
Okay.
the de minimis be completely eliminated forever, or do we believe the threshold amount will go down to a previous low or any adjustments there? I think it's pretty clear the big beautiful bill, but you're more well-read than I am.
It is gone forever, except for the specific carve-outs for international passengers, right, bringing in the air cargo, and bona fide gifts. Those do seem to be the only ones allowed that are still in there. So those are still permitted, but this isn't a reduction in the value limit. Yeah, it was $200 pre-2016, and then it bumped from $200 to $800 in 2016. This isn't going back to that. This is a pure elimination, especially like in law, as of July 1st, 2027, except for just a couple of those small provisions. Yeah.
It's worth noting it is bipartisan support as well.
Also
the Biden
true.
administration issued a proposed rule change, that would have taken effect in 18 to 24 months from last fall. So there's bipartisan support for modifications or changes outright. So worth noting. There's some questions about USMCA. Do those products maintain their duty exempt status? And I think the answer is it depends, but you're better at this than I am.
Yeah, as with all of, I should just be able to answer every question starting with it depends. But yes, they can still be claimed under USMCA. And USMCA is the only free trade agreement under some circumstances where you can still get truly duty-free treatment. A lot of the other free trade agreements out there, Japan, Korea, Australia, Oman, all of those other free trade agreements, so many of those, they still have to pay the IEEPA reciprocal rate. USMCA does have the provision that eliminates the IEEPA rates and the IEEPA fentanyl rates for Canadian and Mexico origin, not export goods. So those products do still qualify for if they meet all the requirements, regional value content, tariff shipped, all that for USMCA. Those can still be brought in duty free. And they can be, but not by the parcel, or I'm sorry, by the postal service, if that was part of the question. If that person was wondering, well, what about the flat fee and the postal rates? Those will still apply. Those are still applying to every country, including Canada and Mexico. But if you wanted to go to conventional entries, USMCA is still valid, does still provide quite a lot of duty savings to importers. Something I mentioned last week's webinar is that we saw in June, the number of USMCA claims from Canada went on 54% of entries to 81% between May and June. So a lot of importers are starting to use USMCA that maybe hadn't been before because the value of USMCA is so high right now.
It's also worth noting that it depends here, which is if goods are produced in other parts of the world and transformed, there are very specific duty requirements, even under USMCA. Reach out to us and we can clarify.
Yep.
There's a question. Is there any talk of customs utilizing better technology to screen the flow of fentanyl into the U.S. instead of this new method? I think the assumption of this question is partially, is there a chance de minimis comes back if we can handle the fentanyl crisis? I would encourage the asker of this question and inquiring minds. Early last year, the Customs and Border Patrol released a quite extensive report on the state of de minimis packages. In 2023, similarly, they quote over 1 billion packages entering under the de minimis program into the United States. That number has certainly grown pretty explosively over the last 18 months, and then this year dropped off a cliff. It's worth noting there's quite a review there of both the staffing and equipment required in that report. I think it's quite extensive, very interesting, but also procurement of those systems and those pieces of equipment is quite difficult to hit the number required to clear all of the packages of this de minimis program. Marcus, anything to add?
No, I don't think so. I think there's at least kind of one, there's still some like leading language in the recent executive order that maybe suggests even for postal, it may go away at some point in the future as well. Like that's not an unreasonable assumption. So postal may just be kind of a stopping point until full de minimis elimination, except for just a handful of things. Now, Don't know when that is. That could still be, a while away, but that is still something in terms of the actual technology. I know they've been targeting this for a while. They've been looking to try to improve their methods. And going through the postal service, a lot of these kind of methods for trying to catching drugs are in all these postal sort centers. So like a lot of them have already kind of been in there. They've had services for this, and maybe that's actually kind of the reason why postal is persisting. I this as a hypothesis whenever I talked to you, Darby. Maybe they like the postal service option because there's already so much existing infrastructure with kind of government agencies already integrated to the postal service. Maybe sending things into like postal sort centers makes it a little bit easier to try to track some of these packages down versus de minimis, where it just could go through any airport in the US, and it was very much a black box, that doesn't really kind of have that same sorting and technological focus. So yeah, I would imagine so, but none specific I'm aware of. Yeah.
Makes total sense. I think there's other topics around the ship from location that the postal services require, knowing customers, et cetera. Here's an interesting one. This is a bit of a pivot. For 232 tariffs, what about things like deodorant that have aluminum in the actual deodorant? Is that steel and aluminum tariff? It's an oddball question for this webinar, but it is interesting.
All right. At this time, there are no Section 232 tariffs on deodorant, except for deodorant sprays, and some of the cans got affected in the last 2 weeks. But in terms of like the deodorants in which the active ingredient is like the aluminum zirconium thing, no, thank goodness, not at this time. But it does apply to quite a few things. It applies to the aluminum content of many things, and maybe I'll just pivot to talk 232 in general. Yeah. So the new stuff that came out, they do allow 232 content to be broken out on separate lines and to be declared. It can be a different line, and so just the value of the aluminum content is what you pay the 232 duties on. You don't pay 232 on the non-aluminum content. And so, yeah, hopefully, I hope to never have to answer that question in reality or with a live entry, I should say. So, yeah, we'll have to see. Yep.
If we get there, we've come a long way. A question here is, as an importer of record, can I advise a postal network that I actually want my customs broker to clear the shipment instead of them? I think there's a clear answer.
Yes, you can. Ooh. Yeah, yes, you can. A lot of them will allow for what they call a broker select option. Now, a word of caution here. These can be very painful in terms of like how your broker gets that information, because in order to clear, your broker needs the commercial documents, which maybe you have, and maybe all that documentation I alluded to, maybe you're able to provide that to the broker. The other part that the broker needs is the shipping information to know, okay, what vessel or airline did this come on? What was the master airway bill of lading, a house airway bill? Did it move in bond through the United States? Which port did it arrive at? Which port is it clearing at? Getting that information from some of these carriers is not easy, and so it can definitely lead to delays. So I would probably say if you want to start doing this, talk about how, I think it may be a question to ask one of these parcel carriers, is how will you provide this information to my customs broker, and how quickly will you promise to provide this information to my customs broker? Because that's where I think the problem is on some of those kind of broker select options with parcel shipments clearing as formal entries.
We're dropping in the chat those 2 HTS codes that were mentioned by name for samples. One thing to note, as Marcus mentioned, there are requirements. They seem to need to be destroyed in an unusable state. The quantities are limited. The values claimed are there. This is an asterisk here of those prototype HTS codes have requirements to them. Please, 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 please follow all rules and regulations of the United States Customs.
Don't use them when you're not supposed to. If it feels wrong, it might be wrong. It probably is. Yeah.
If it feels wrong, yeah. Question, is the postal flat fee in addition to the postage freight cost? Yes, it is a fee paid to Customs and Border Patrol, not a fee paid to any postal service for remedying that good across customs. It is 100% a separate fee. It is not included in the label. Very simple question, but one worth addressing.
Yep.
Marcus, there's a couple questions here, and then maybe one more after this that we can get to is talking about the buy price of the good versus the sell price to the customer. I know you covered that, but can you clarify landed cost versus the buy cost versus the sold retail price or wholesale price sold to the customer?
Yeah, so I'm just sort of using kind of two terms just to kind of keep things pretty simple. Buy price is kind of like what you, maybe the importer, purchase it from your overseas supplier, and then your retail price is what you then sell, like in an e-commerce setup, to the end consumer. So on your website, it's listed for $80, but you then buy it for $10, right? And then there's expenses, and you keep a profit, right? So the buy price is 10, you're selling it retail for 80. Those are like where there's maybe a possibility. So in the current state, the bona fide sale for export, the sale that causes a good to enter, enter the U.S. commerce to become an import, is usually how customs is looking at for determining value in a transaction environment. So I do want to just stress this. Valuation is very specific and can be very complex. This is not something that maybe you wanted to do, but the general tenet that I'm talking about does hold, is that in the retail environment, the old de minimis environment, a lot of those sales were based on what is the retail price, that $80 mark, right? So what is like causing the sale for importation? Well, it doesn't leave China if somebody in America doesn't pay $80, right? But what if you start moving all your inventory to the United States? Well, the sale that causes it to leave China was actually a $10 per unit sale. So now you pay duty on that 10% on the $10 value, rather than having to pay postal rate value on the $80 instead. So that's the difference between like the retail price there and the buy price from your supplier. So if you're sitting in the middle here, if you want to move, your fulfillment to the United States, you want to move all your inventory to the United States, doesn't want to sit overseas, you may be able to use some of the existing valuation rules to pay duty based on your buy price that you get from the manufacturer, not based on the retail price that you're selling to a consumer in the United States. But once again, please do make sure you check your scenario. What's the relationship between your parties? Who's related to who? What are the terms of sale of your contract? Who gets paid for it? Where are your warehouses now? There are a lot of different questions about how these things can come up. So this is not something to just sort of like say, okay, Marcus says every case you can always use the buy price. There will be many cases when you cannot use the buy price, but as a general rule, this is maybe the silver lining where you can maybe find some cost savings from switching from de minimis to conventional entries.
I think with that, that's a great way to leave off. The last thing I will say is, again, your situation is very specific, the country of origin, the location in the country of origin in some cases, the labor that produced that good, the content that produced the materials that went into the good that was produced, the transformation that occurred. There are so many specific use cases here where the customs law is very specific and applicable to your direct scenario. My advice to you is navigate this with a customs professional that you trust. I'm going to go to the next slide. I think it's a resources slide. Perfect. We'll flash this up on the screen for a couple of links, tariffs.flexport.com, not tariff. That being said, please reach out to us if you have any questions that we can be of service to. Our goal here is that every shipment that you have would come in compliantly, would come in accurately, would come in timely, and we would love to assist you with making sure you get the specific clarifications you need for your business. Customs is a long-standing process of many governments across the world, and certainly it is very, very, very specific. Marcus, any closing remarks or anything you would like to share as we've gone over quite extensively on Q&A?
Yeah, I hope people are still stuck around and they wanted to hear something. No, but that was today's webinar.